This is Uncollared, off-the-cuff conversations with progressive pastors at the intersection of religion, politics, and culture. I'm Todd Leonard. I'm senior pastor at Glendale City Church. In a moment, I'll be joined by Shane Kinnison, senior pastor at First Baptist Church of Glendale. And we're pleased to welcome today Jonathan Stoner, a chaplain with Dignity Health at Glendale Memorial Hospital and soon to be part of the spiritual care team at City of Hope. He is also a postulant to the priesthood of the Episcopal Church. Today our conversation is about Pride Month. How do congregations relate to Pride Month and to our LGBTQ brothers and sisters at this time of the year? I hope you enjoy the conversation. All right, guys, it is great to be with you today. Shane, as always, happy to see you. And Jonathan, really glad that you can join us today for our conversation. It is Pride Month in the USA, and here in the LA metro area, it's very important in our communities, even as in many ways it's still happening virtually. In Glendale, just for the second year, we are having a Pride Month experience that is led by our local LGBTQ organization, Glendale Out. And that raises a question for us as pastors of congregations from different backgrounds and for anybody who's part of religious organizations. What can communities of faith do to make sure that we honor the dignity and worth of those who are LGBTQ brothers and sisters? And Jonathan, I know especially this is something close to your heart.
So thanks so much for having me, Todd and Shane. It's great to be here. And before we had met today for the podcast recording, I had sent you guys a link to an article. It's by the former president of Fuller Theological Seminary, Richard Mao, who has always been a leader, a Christian leader that I've looked up to when it comes to this idea of dialoguing with convicted civility. And it's a skill that it doesn't seem to be being practiced as much in these polarized and polarizing times. But he tells a story in this article that I shared about speaking at this Presbyterian church where he talked about his own stance of having a more traditional view of sexuality and gender. And there was a couple, I guess, that spoke to him afterward and talked with him about how they were so glad that he stood up for traditional values. And he thanked them for coming up to talk with him, but then he interrupted and he said, thank you so much, but he said, I think we really need to think new pastoral thoughts on this in the lives of our congregations. He said, it's a simple fact that we evangelicals have in the past and in the present been inexcusably cruel to persons who experience same-sex attraction. He says that the couple looked at one another and they I guess the husband or the wife gave the other person permission to share. And the wife told him, thank you for saying that. Our son is gay. He's in a committed relationship. When he came home with his partner to introduce his partner to the family, the mom and dad basically, for some reason, they just basically talked about their area of disagreement in terms of their understanding of, sexuality and gender based on the scriptures. And I guess after explaining that for, they said 15 minutes, they said, this is the last time we're going to bring this up, because they said, what their focus was is that they said, we love you. We love both of you. We want to love you, not on any condition that you have to agree with us on this. We want you to know that we want you to come home anytime you want because we love you and we want to be with you. And that Christmas, their son came back home, went to church with the family for the Christmas Eve service with his partner. And I guess it was just a really wonderful time of the family coming together, despite their very significant differences when it comes to this issue. They chose love, they chose relationship, even though they are not on the same page in terms of their understanding of sexual ethics.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jonathan. I think, like you said, there is such a lack of civility in our society and in our congregations and our denominations around many issues, not just this issue, that there's purity tests on either the left or the right, that you have to be in lockstep agreement or else you're a heretic, or you're not a Christian, or you're not an American. And I think what you just shared from Richard Mao is a wonderful expression of somebody who's trying to be in the place of compassion and dignity for people, rather than in a place of condemnation and purity culture. I'm in a congregation that is part of a denomination that has traditional views on sexuality and marriage and things like that, and it is frankly having a very difficult time uh, trying to be compassionate around this issue. It doesn't know how to be compassionate around this issue. It has a statement that says that LGBTQ people should be treated with dignity and loved and respected as God's sons and daughters, but the practice within our in the congregations within our denomination are either non-existent or still very cruel and frankly hostile.
As both of you have indicated regarding civil discourse and the lack thereof, I concur that, as far as I'm concerned, our civil discourse capacity is at an all-time low in our country and culture. We're galvanized, crystallized. We're definitely in opposite corners, and we're screaming and yelling at each other at the tops of our voices. And then there are also those evidences of violence and physical harm that result as a part of that. So yes, civil discourse is truly at a low, and yet is that in effect the plank that needs to be placed into the bridge? You know, to be bridge building people, should we be putting those planks of civil discourse in front of ourselves as paving stones or as footstones, as footsteps toward one another? And so I appreciate what you're saying this morning, Jonathan, because it gives me a sense of hope and a sense of vision that there still can be honorable conversation, even as people are holding on to their convictions or holding on to their values. There can be honorable conversation, and that conversation can lead us to perhaps new levels and places of peace.
Yeah, and I think I think this topic is going to be deeply personal to each one of us, and I also think it's going to be deeply personal to each person listening to the podcast. And I think that everybody has their own stories, whether it's within their families, within their circle of friends, within their congregations. And this is something that we, whether folks have like it or not, this is something that is not going away, and it's something that we have to choose, how we're going to respond to, whether it's somebody in our congregation, whether it's a family member, and I think that what I love about this story that Richard Mao shares is that the couple in the story chose relationship, they chose love, they chose to stay united as a family, even despite their distinct differences. And I think that we as a country, we as, even like our looking at our planet, if we could look at our relationships with fellow human beings as if we were part of one big family, I wonder if we would handle these kinds of conversations, these kinds of differences about whatever the issue is. I mean, obviously today we're talking about Pride Month, and that kind of leads into conversations about marriage and sexuality and gender and those kinds of things. But even when it comes to other divisive issues in our world, in our denominations, if we could think of the other person who has a different opinion from us, or who it differs from us in terms of their biblical convictions, could we think of them not only as conversation partners, but could we think of them as a brother, as a sister, as a family member, someone that we are bound to, someone that we are connected to on this deep, inextricable, level. And I always go back to Martin Luther King Jr., who talked about humanity being bound together in this inescapable network of mutuality. And I think when we have that perspective, then we are our brother's keeper, we are our sister's keeper, we are bound to one another, we have obligations to one another, and we can't just slam the door and walk away, or build a wall and say, yes, you're shut out and we're not going to have a relationship.
Well, Dr. King did talk about that single garment of destiny, and that which affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so we are inextricably connected together, as you've indicated. And also too, along with that, he reminded us that truth is never found in the thesis or the antithesis. Truth is always found somewhere in the middle. And so the question for us is, what's in the middle? And as we explore the middle of the situation, as we explore together in away from the extremes or away from the edges, as we explore further into the middle, that's where perhaps truth is truly unearthed. And also too, perhaps you've heard that old saying that under stress we do values. And so if you want to know what someone values, watch how they react or respond when their life is under stress. Mm-hmm. Well, stress is either positive or negative, right? But when we're under stress, we do values. And Dr. King never would have asked anyone to lay their values at the door as they approach the table of dialogue. He always wanted people to bring their values with them to the table. So my question for us today would be, what is the greater or deeper or more abiding motivation that moves us and prompts us toward this kind of convicted civility dialogue, as you've indicated in the article that you've quoted? What's the greater motivation that moves us in this direction?
And I think I think, just to echo what you're saying, Shane, is we can't just be motivated to not talk about the things that are core to our values. You can't just say, well, in order for us to get along, we have to leave these things out. But those values have to be at our heart. But yeah, the key value is, and I just love about that couple story that Mao talked about, is they wanted to love their son no matter what. They wanted him in their lives, and because it meant him being in their lives, it meant that his partner was in their lives, and that was more important to them than getting on the same page theologically or philosophically about that issue. And I have seen so many times in the context of the congregation I serve, where we've taken a very proactive approach to honor and show dignity to people who are LGBTQ. There are many people within our congregation who would still hold to the traditional understanding of marriage, but who would give up their right eye to protect some of the men and women in our congregation who identify as LGBTQ, because they love them so much. And they've made that choice, that say, I don't understand it, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but these are wonderful people. I love them to death. They're sweethearts. And for them, that has been that has been the primary value. It has not been trying to fix somebody. It has been trying to love somebody. And I've heard story after story, and I've seen story after story of how uh, a gay man or a lesbian has melted the heart of another person in our congregation, and that person has realized what was first in their priorities, and that was to see the humanity, see the image of God. And I think that's another piece of it, is to have a fundamental, solid understanding that no matter who we're looking at, we're looking into the eyes of somebody made in the image of God, and so you have to honor that person as somebody made in the image of God. You Before you go on to anything else, you say this was made fearfully and wonderfully made in the image of God.
One of the things I've been reflecting on a lot lately, and probably it's because, we just went through Ramadan, and
Mm.
I work as an interfaith chaplain who serves people of all faiths and no faith, and I've had the privilege of serving our Muslim brothers and sisters here in the hospital. And one of the stories that came to mind recently that I was reflecting on after a very significant interaction with a Muslim family that I got to know here at the hospital, who actually invited me to prayers and invited me to break fast with them during Ramadan, is a story that my mom told me about. There was a Muslim family that came as refugees from Kosovo years ago, to West Michigan, where I grew up. And my mom has always been I kind of refer to her as like a bleeding heart conservative, because she's someone who holds to the traditional view on pretty much every issue, but she is the most compassionate, loving, give you the shirt off her back type person that you'll ever meet. And so when these refugees came to West Michigan, there was an agency in our hometown that was kind of connecting families with these refugee families so that they would almost like adopt them. And so my parents signed up for this, and they ended up kind of getting paired with this Muslim family that had come over. And long story short, my mom talks about now, because I've asked her to reflect on it, what her experience was like working with this family for 20 years, is I said, Mom, what did you learn from that experience? Because she started off as, this faithful evangelical Christian wanting to share her faith with this family and to see them become followers of Jesus. That did not happen. But she stayed in relationship with this family, and after 20 years, she became like a older sister, like a grandmother to the children of this family. And she said what God told her, or what she felt like God spoke to her heart after all those years, was that you wanted to change this family and for them to believe like you believe, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to teach you something about yourself, and I wanted to teach you something about my love for you. And I wanted, through your relationship with this family, I wanted to change you. It wasn't about, you changing this family. And so I think I've just sat with that recently, because I've thought about how many times I, as a Christian, have wanted to have someone else see the world the way that I see it, and to force them or kind of persuade them, coerce them, argue with them to take on my values, or to take on my worldview. And I think in my journey of chaplaincy, it's been this process of me realizing how much I have to learn from the patients and their families and my colleagues at the hospital, who come from different cultures, different religious backgrounds, and who differ from me in terms of their life experience, their stories, in terms of their beliefs and values. But I always come away from these encounters realizing, wow, God, you wanted to teach me something through them. It wasn't necessarily as important to you seemingly that I teach them something. It was more important that about what you were doing in me. And so I think when it comes to this issue of what does it look like for us as Christians to celebrate pride, or can we celebrate pride, that kind of thing. I think that I always go back to that story of my mom. And I just think about, what if our posture was, God, what can I learn here? How do you want to change me through this encounter? And how can I, be the embodiment of your love to this person, to this group of people, while also being open to you loving me through this other person, and me having an experience of your love through someone that I might not expect to be the vessel or the conduit of your love in my life.
Well, it's obvious in this conversation today that part of that deeper motivation and that deeper underlying unction within us is the idea of the Imago Dei, the image of God, of each and all of us being created in the image of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, each of and all of us. So that is a very principled and very far-reaching motivation for us, and for many in any perhaps faith community, that the image of God is extremely powerful, and could be equally powerful in anyone's life, regardless of faith or no faith at all. That God's presence and God's image is stamped on each and all of us, and that's what we share in common. Also, too, that deeper motivation of the other-centric over against egocentric philosophy and way of looking at life. Who's first here? Am I first, or are others first? Regardless of station, sexuality, orientation, giftedness, color, creed, race, accent, culture, family of origin, how do I consider others first? These are long and ancient holdings in the life of civilization. And perhaps we've lost some of that in our current climate, but I think that we can rediscover it with one another. And then I would add a third motivation. This is coming out of the wellspring of my spirit, and that is the Christocentric nature of Christ crucified, raised from the dead by the power of God. And he gives me freedom. So it's freedom that comes from the Christocentric work of Christ crucified and raised from the dead. And so when I connect then the Imago Dei, the image of God, with the Christocentric freedom that comes to me from Christ crucified and raised from the dead, that empowers me then, perhaps, it empowers me to become other-centric over against only or supremely egocentric. And it then fourthly opens up a door of application for that freedom, particularly in a democratic society, in a pluralistic society, in a multicultural society. It opens up that freedom to recognize that we all have a place in this country that we call our home, in this culture that we share together. And so for me, those are very deep motivations.
Shane, I really appreciated that you brought up freedom, because I think so much of where we get stuck is that we aren't willing to allow people to be free and trust God to work in their lives where they are. That for some reason, too often, and Jonathan, you even mentioned this too, this desire to try to persuade people, to change people, to make them, and Christ set us free. Christ set us free from having to prove ourselves before God, and therefore we need to be able to do the same thing and set people free from having to prove their worth to us or prove that they deserve our attention, our affection. Um, that has been removed through our understanding of the ministry of Jesus as Christians. And I think that is a fundamental shift for me, is when I can interact with people as they are, knowing that God is at work in them like God is at work in me. It allows me to just be with people. And then like you said, and about to Jonathan, about how you end up being surprised that you end up becoming the one ministered to rather than the one who ministers. For me, the greatest joy in life for me now is when God ministers to me through a person I didn't expect it to happen through. And then it's like, oh, this is the best thing ever, because God just destroyed my misconceptions and showed up in a way that was magnificent.
Same for me. And I think, I think we should have realized, when Jesus told us the parable of the Good Samaritan, we should have realized that he was saying, hey, this is going to happen to you. You're going to be ministered to by people of, people that you might even, whose views you might disagree with, or, you might have political differences, you might have theological differences, you might have cultural differences, but I think what I love about that story is that person who, that person is the agent of God's grace in the person's life who was, the Jewish person's life who was robbed and beaten. And I think I want to be open for how God can use the person I least expect to reveal his love, to reveal his grace. One of the things from CPE that will stick with me for the rest of my life is we studied the work of Carl Rogers, the psychologist, and he talks about having this posture of unconditional positive regard when we're meeting patients. And I've taken that and I've said, okay, I'm going to try to embody that in the hospital with patients and families and colleagues, but I'm also going to try to embody that out in the world, because I think when we have that posture of unconditional positive regard, that opens the door for these kinds of encounters, these kinds of divine appointments to happen. Because when we're not walking around with a chip on our shoulder, pointing our finger and judging every person we come across, when we're open and open to that person even being a vessel for God's grace and God's mercy in our lives, amazing things can happen. Walls can be torn down, relationships can be fostered, and I think that we can be surprised on a daily basis by God showing up in the most unexpected places, and that can be a real gift to us and also to the people that we're encountering as well.
I want to share this video that we all looked at earlier as we start to wrap up. I think this addresses one of those other things that I've heard some Christians raise about Pride Month, and I think Father James Martin has a good approach to a good response to that.
Can Catholics celebrate Pride Month when the LGBTQ community marks its place in society, especially since pride is, after all, one of the 7 deadly sins? Well, first of all, remember that there are 2 definitions of pride. The first is satisfaction that comes from your own accomplishments, which can morph into vanity, which is bad. But the second kind of pride is a consciousness of your own dignity. And that's closer to what Pride Month represents, a celebration of the human dignity of a group of people who have been for so long treated like dirt. And for the religious person, it's a celebration of them as beloved children of God. It's especially important for churches to celebrate Pride, since a great deal of the rejection and even violence that the LGBTQ community has faced has been motivated by religion, or at least what people think religion teaches. The Catechism of the Catholic Church asks us to treat LGBTQ people with respect, compassion, and sensitivity, and participating in Pride events, or at least supporting our LGBTQ friends, is one way to do this. And just because you celebrate Pride doesn't mean you have to agree with what every video, every article, or even every float in a parade has to say. It's more about supporting the fundamental human rights of this community, the right to live in safety, the right to be treated as equals, and the right to be fully welcomed into society. Besides, complaints about the use of the word pride don't seem to happen in other situations. People say, I'm proud to be Catholic, or I'm proud to be an American, and no one objects to it or says that it's vanity. Pride is not about vanity, but human dignity. Maybe the best way to think about pride is to imagine what you'd say to a young person who finally summoned up the courage to tell you that they were LGBTQ. You know that God created them. You know that God loves them, and you know that God wants them to accept who they are. So you would probably say, I am so proud of you for being able to say that. That's the kind of pride that we celebrate this month. So happy Pride.
The church actually has a lot of work to do, that we actually have not helped our LGBTQ brothers and sisters find their dignity in God. And one way that we can do that is to support them and celebrate Pride with them.
And I think, I'll speak, from my first hand experience of going to Pride. And I will say that even though I have become much more progressive over the last 20 years, there are still things I encounter at Pride parades that make me uncomfortable and that push my buttons, and that and so, I think I liked what Father Martin had to say, because he talked about, it's not about agreeing with everything. It's not about endorsing everything. It's not about condoning everything. I hope what we're saying, if we're going to be celebrating Pride and celebrating our brothers and sisters and our gender nonconforming siblings, if we're going to be celebrating these folks and supporting them and loving them, then I think it's about saying, I see the image of God in you. I see your inherent worth. I see your value. You matter. You are loved. You are deeply loved. And I see you, and I love you, and I cherish you, and I will fight for you, and I will fight for your life, and I will fight for your right to exist, for your right to thrive, and that I will fight for you just like I would fight for a member of my own family. I think that's the posture that I've wanted to have with my siblings who are, and when I say siblings, I mean siblings in the sense of within the body of Christ and also outside the body of Christ who identify as LGBTQ. I want to have the kind of posture of unconditional positive regard for every single person on this planet, and especially folks who historically have been maligned, mistreated, marginalized, who've been shut out, kicked out, who've been barred entry to even to our churches sometimes, and have been told they're not welcome. So I think we do have a lot of work to do, and I think we do have a lot of work to repair the damage that has been done for generations. And it's not going to be quick, it's not going to be easy, but I think instead of taking the posture of waiting for folks to come to us, and even if we put up a rainbow flag in front of our church, that's the least we could do. I mean, I think really what we need to do is we need to get out into the city, out with the people, getting to know people, building relationships. And instead of coming with a posture of, oh, this is what I have to tell you about what I believe, instead coming with the posture of humility and of curiosity and saying, I want to learn from you. I want to hear about your life. I want to hear about your experiences. I want to find out how I can be of service to you, how I can be a blessing in your life, how I can, love you as my neighbor, because I think, I think all of us, regardless of our stance on gender and sexuality, we do have an obligation to love our neighbors. And I think we need to be asking the question, what does it look like for me as a follower of Christ to love my LGBTQ neighbors during Pride, to tangibly love them and to show them the love of God? What does that look like? And I think that's a question we need to be wrestling with this whole month and every June.
In the words of Jesus of Nazareth, who I think was such a powerful teacher because he was sometimes such a simple teacher, do unto others as you would want others to do to you.
thanks for listening. We'd love to get your feedback on today's conversation. Please email us at uncollaredpodcast@gmail.com. Uncollared can be found on most podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. You can also watch the podcast on YouTube. And please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.